Hi guys, BuildZoid here, and welcome to the third weekly HWbot score roundup. Yeah, it's late again. It's gonna be fixed. It's gonna be fixed. I have a plan. But yeah, scores on HWbot have been posted in the last week. Some of them are really epic. We're gonna be looking at some of those, not all of them, because the video would be too long if I covered every score that I thought was even slightly cool. So. Yeah, let's get into it. Starting off with OGS's 3D Mark Firestrike Extreme. You've probably already heard about this score from multiple different places, because yeah, it's been all over the news. But I actually got to talk to Stavros from OGS. OGS is a two-person overclocking team of Stavros and Phil, and yeah, so I actually got to talk to him a little bit about doing this score and running the card and yeah, so I've got more details than everybody else about this. Anyway, the score is first place Firestrike Extreme with a single GPU. The GPU in question is an RX 6900 XT Red Devil Ultimate. This is a retail card, so you know they went out and just bought a Red Devil Ultimate because yeah, that's what you do. A lot of people assume that you know when they see a score like this run on a system produced on a system like this, the assumption is that everything is sponsored, like motherboard, GPU, and yeah. Reality is a lot of the time it's not actually. Now OGS are a very big right now they're ranked #1 on HWbot, so they've been a top overclocking team for a very long time, and they do have some hardware support from Asus, Galax, Crucial, and Thermal Grizzly, as you can tell from down here. But yeah, when it comes to power color GPUs or really any AMD GPUs, they have to buy them. Which I'm not really sure. Actually, no, I think some of the overclockers who are supported by ASRock might be getting 6900 XTs. Also, maybe some of the Asus might be sending out the Strix card to some of the overclockers they're supporting. Yeah, but generally, GPUs are just generally hard to get as hardware support goes. So yeah, this is a retail card, no bidding involved. It's one of one. You know, just run whatever you happen to end up getting from the store. And for voltage control, they were using the Elmore EVC2, which you can sort of tell that it's soldered onto the back of the card right there. And yeah, and in terms of actually running the card sub-zero, their card has a cold boot bug at -50 degrees Celsius. So that means if you want to restart the system, you have to have the card at -50, because if you're below that, it will not restart. The card will not initialize anymore. And then for actually running benchmarks, they were at around -80 degrees Celsius, because below that, you start getting tons and tons of artifacts and instability. It really looks like a memory problem, but it's probably the issue with artifacts is just because you have artifacts that look like they're caused by memory instability is there's a lot of things between your memory chips, right? So the GDDR6 memory chips on the card, and the actual stream processors processing the data coming from the memory chips. So if any of the things in that chain is unstable, so the memory controllers or whatever connects the memory controller to the cache in the card, or the cache is unstable, whatever, right, it's going to look like memory instability. This is just how that works. And so yeah, below -80 degrees Celsius, currently the card, their card gets really unstable. We don't know if that's there might be cards that tolerate lower temperatures better. There might be it might be possible to rectify some of the stability with adjusting some of the minor voltage rails on the 6900 XT. The thing is with these cards is that there is a lot of different voltage rails, right? You've got your you've got VCore, SoC, VDDCI memory, and then there's also minor voltage rails like 1.8 volts, 0.75 volts, and there's a few what looks like linear regulators very near to the GPU core that it's I don't even know what voltage they produce, but they look like regulators, so they might be important. And yeah, so right now 6900 XT, well, the thing is, it's only very recently that AMD has kindly produced the 6900 XTK cards with the fully unlocked clocks, and so these cards are sort of research in progress when it comes to getting them to run properly on Sub-Zero, because not many people have, gotten the new 6900 XT cards, 6900 XT unlocked cards yet, and run them Sub-Zero. So yeah, we might see even higher frequencies in the future as people figure out how to get them to work at lower temperatures. It might not be possible. These cards might just not work below, whatever temperature they happen to work at. And in that case, this might already be very like the limit of what 6900 XTs are capable of doing. But yeah, very, very impressive score from OGS with the 6900 XT. And then for the CPU for Firestrike, they used a 5950X at 5.6 gigahertz with 3800 CL12 memory. And the reason you use a 5950X for Firestrike Extreme is because you need that giant physics score. Currently, the 5950X just produces the highest physics score that you can get in Firestrike Extreme. It's also capable of actually feeding the card in the GPU test. And so, like for Firestrike Extreme, this is the best CPU available right now, as long as you're running 1 or 2 GPUs. Unfortunately, if you want to run more GPUs than that, the 5950X does not have enough PCIe lanes. But also, multi-GPU setups are very dead for modern GPUs, so that's not really a huge issue. Anyway, then OGS also took that same 6900 XT and ran it through 3D Mark 11 performance, where the peak clock is lower. So this was done with a peak clock of as high as 3.32 gigahertz. And the reason I say peak clock is if you've ever run a modern AMD GPU, more modern than Vega, you would know that the frequency is anything but static. It constantly bounces up and down, even if you're on Sub-Zero, which is like on NVIDIA cards, when you take them Sub-Zero, the boost algorithm sort of disables itself. On AMD cards, it's still very much active and kind of gets in the way a lot of the time. Yeah, so the Firestrike Extreme run was at 3.3 gigahertz peak. 3D Mark 11 was at 3.25 gigahertz peak. And the reason why 3D Mark 11, like this is an older benchmark than Firestrike, why you would run this at lower clocks than Firestrike is very, very simple. This has more GPU tests in it. Those GPU tests take longer to run. And also, funnily enough, I believe GT3 actually pulls more power than any part of Firestrike Extreme does. So this is like 3D Mark 11, and oddly enough, is actually harder on GPU stability than 3D Mark Firestrike Extreme is. So yeah, that's just kind of interesting differences between some of the benchmarks. And a lot of that comes down to just the length of the test and also just what kind of workload the test is doing. And now here the OGS use a 10900K at 6.9 gigahertz with 4800 CL14 memory. Because there is a physics score in 3D Mark 11, and that physics test, I believe, scales all the way up to 32 threads, same as Firestrike Extreme does. However, the 6900 XT is averaging like 400 to 690 FPS in some of these in the GPU tests. And when you're pushing that much frame rate, you really start hitting the limits of the single-threaded performance of your CPU. And so that's why they ended up switching over to the 10900K, because because with the 5950X, it's just not possible to sustain those kinds of frame rates. And I know everybody's going to be like, but isn't the 5950X better at in gaming benchmarks? Yeah, that's not like this is a 7 gigahertz 10900K with 4800 CL14 memory. This thing has way more single-threaded performance than what you normally see in ambient benchmark configurations, especially like the memory, the memory setup here is also just way stronger than what you'd normally see in any gaming benchmark comparison. So for extreme overclocking, the 10900K is still a more capable CPU than the 5950X when it comes to running a benchmark like 3D Mark 11. And then other than that, OGS just sort of went on a general GPU benchmarking rampage, and so, they also had a 3090 score, but we've seen their 3090. It's very fast. They're very good at, taking world records with that RTX 3090 Hall of Fame they have. We don't have to see it again. The other score they posted that got my attention is this right here. which is 3D Mark 2001 SE, very, very old benchmark with quad GPUs. So this is two 7970X2s, so those are dual core cards. I'm a huge fan of dual core cards. I'm a huge fan of multi-GPU setups, and so of course this score had to be included. Now, 3D Mark 2001, very old, very, like very old benchmark. You don't really need to push the GPUs at all, like much at all. In order to get a solid score in it, but it is, and so it ends up being sort of just like a single-threaded CPU performance test. And so for this, they're running an 11900K with 4 cores and 4 threads enabled, because this benchmark, I'm surprised that you would run this with even 4 cores. Like, this benchmark's really old. I'm surprised it understands what a quad core is. 11900K, 4800 CL14 on the memory. And then, 2 Power Color 7970X2 cards. So, yeah, also, like, just a really cool score as well. And mostly because I'm a big fan of multi-GPU setups like this. And there was one other thing I wanted to mention. Well, the neat thing in, like... So I kind of think it's neat that we have these old benchmarks where every time a new faster CPU is released, you get an excuse to revisit some really old GPUs, right? Because outside of that, there's not really much reason to run a multi-GPU setup like this. And as somebody who's a big fan of multi-GPU setups like this, I'm just happy that this is still somewhat relevant, even though it's in a irrelevant benchmark category, because the thing about quad GPU 3D Mark 2001 is there's so much overhead with that multi-GPU setup that, in fact, it is nowhere near the fastest 3D Mark 2001 overall score. Like, the fastest overall score currently, I believe, is on... Well, actually, we can just check that. HWbot being very slow again. So if we pull up 3D Mark 2001, where is it? Yeah, so the top score in this benchmark is like single GPU, and you can see how like quad GPU is way slower than single GPU. And yeah, most of that is just down to like there is so much overhead when you run 4 GPUs that it's just like, yeah, single GPU has the record. Also, whoa, this is a really old... Like, this score has been holding up for a really long time. Because that's still on a 7740X. I would have figured this would have already been... Like, this would have gone down to the 11900K at this point. But anyway, yeah, so OGS have produced some really, really impressive, GPU scores in the past week. And so we've just looked at those. So let's move on to some of the other scores. Next, we have Char 00750. Who took the 6-core Cinebench R20 world record with a 5600X doing 6 gigahertz. This is the fastest 5600X to run Cinebench R20 in terms of just raw frequency, and also the only 5600X to ever run Cinebench R20 at over 6 gigahertz, even if it's over by, like 7 megahertz. But still, that counts for something as far as I'm concerned. So... yeah, he really, really pushed that like CPU to the limit. You can see here, like all the previous top scores were like approaching the 6 gigahertz mark, but none of them actually got past it. So yeah, congratulations to Char on managing to push the chip ever so slightly further. Also, what's really, well, what I find interesting about the score is that he did actually manage to run the Infinity Fabric at over 1900 on liquid nitrogen, which... generally the Infinity Fabric apparently isn't too cooperative at low temperatures. So I'm really surprised that he's getting it to run at 1933. And yeah, just overall a really, really solid Cinebench R20 score here. It's a shame he didn't post a picture of the setup, though. I guess it wouldn't really be much. Like, it's a single LN2 pot, operation. You have an LN2 pot on your CPU, and then there's the motherboard and some insulation. So, like, you can kind of imagine what that would probably look like. And for the score, he was using the Crosshair 8 Dark Hero motherboard. So, yeah, very, very impressive score right there. Congratulations to Char on that. And let's move on to the next score. Next, we have Sens, a second place in Cinebench R20 18 core. with a 10980XE at 5.75 gigahertz. So the thing is, the multi-core benchmarks are all split up rankings by core count. So what's like the 10980XE might stay relevant as like the only 18-core CPU for a very long time, unless like because AMD seems to be pretty happy to make like 12, 16, 32, core count progressions, occasionally a 24 core. But Intel, like, I don't think we're going to see another 18 core anytime soon. So, yeah, the 10980XE might be the might be the the Cinebench R20 18 core CPU forever, because it's the only 18 core that's worth running. But yeah. Anyway, so Sens ran this score on a EVGA X299 Dark. On LN2, of course, which like these chips are really hard to run, so he has it lapped, of course, for better thermal transfer between the LN2 pot and the CPU. And honestly, like getting a 10980XE or any of the high core count Intel Skylake X CPU, or well, X2 high core count X299 CPUs above 5.5 gigahertz is very, very difficult because the heat out, like the power draw and the heat output, and just like keeping the temperature under control on these chips is just super hard because they pull so much power. And so yeah, this is a really, really like impressive score. Because yeah, just 5.75 gigahertz 10980XE, like that's really hard to run. Also, these chips have a cold bug and a cold boot bug. It's normally around minus 110 degrees Celsius. So like these are like you need to really be on top of the temperature control with these. Like that's the biggest issue with them, right? Is just like if this was a full pot benchmark, you could like, because there's other CPUs that also pull a ton of power, but a lot of them are full pot capable. So you can just kind of sit there and keep the LN2 pot filled with liquid nitrogen and you're fine. You don't really like, yeah, the temperature might start crawling up as the benchmark runs because the heat output is so high, but there's really nothing you can do about it. You don't really have to worry about, but the temperature does what the temperature wants. With these, you can't just have the LN2 pot full of LN2 because you're going to freeze the chip out and it's just going to stop running. So you really have to be on top of the temperature control because these chips just produce so much heat, and they have that like pretty nasty cold bug of like minus 110 degrees Celsius. So these are really, really hard to run. Still easier to set up than like a Threadripper, in my opinion. Like the thing is like, yeah, you need to be on top of your temperature control, but at least they don't do anything super weird in my experience. Though the memory controller, the memory controller on them does get a little bit weaker than at ambient, but you can still run settings like what is this? This is like 3960 CL12, especially if you're using a motherboard like the X299 Dark. This is very much the upper limits of what's possible in terms of memory frequency on X299. Well, not memory frequency, but like memory performance on X299 on liquid nitrogen. Like it's really hard to keep, like it's really hard to run a higher frequency memory with these CPUs cold. A lot of the time, like you can't, like even just like 3800 starts being problematic when they're sub-zero. So yeah, very, very impressive score from Sens here, and congratulations to him on that second place, because like running like 10980XEs on liquid nitrogen are like they're a workout, right? Any of the high core count X299 chips is a workout, but when you've got the full 18 cores, it's just that much worse. So good job, Sens. And let's move on to the next score. So we've got another Char 00750 score, and this time it's a Intel Core 2 Extreme QX9650 at 5.8 gigahertz. So this is a just a frequency I believe it's W prime 32 million. So W prime 32 million is a very short, old, multi-threaded benchmark, and I really like it, except it's so short. Like on modern CPUs, it's so short that it doesn't really work properly anymore, and it is very much it's a bit of a weird benchmark. It is, sensitive to like what OS you're running it on, and there's some things you have to do to your operating system to make it run optimally. But it doesn't really care about memory performance, which is why Char is just running like 1600 676, which by DDR3 standards, that's not really that impressive. I don't believe it's even that impressive for LGA 775 like we're looking at here. I mean, let's just take a look at the second place score. 675. Oh, I guess maybe these CPUs are a weaker memory controller. I unfortunately don't know much about 775 CPUs at all. 699. Well, this guy's running his memory really slow. This is like DDR2 speeds. And you know, like he's still in the top 3 of W prime. So that gives you a good idea of how much W prime cares about memory performance. It doesn't. But yeah, it is a weird benchmark to run. Like and like, well, it depends how focused you are on taking first place in it. But yeah, if you're, you know, if you're going for first place, then yeah, it's a weird fiddly benchmark that doesn't care about memory. It's all about your core speed. And yeah, and Shar managed to well outclock Lumi for this one, I think. Well, no, really, that's not as much of a frequency gap as I was expecting. So, yeah, he really did a good job with this run, right? Getting first place with that QX 9650. And here's the setup, and he's not, and to my great surprise, not using a Rampage Extreme. It is still a P5E3 premium motherboard, which I don't know what that is. It's, the thing is, like, I'm with LGA 775 scores, I'm really used to everybody running. Oh, we're not gonna get pictures of it, are we? Because Asus like probably took it off their website. Yeah, so that's the board. Yeah, but anyway, like most of the time on 775, it's just like all the top scores are done with Rampage Extremes. So it's kind of surprising to see this done on something other than a Rampage Extreme. Anyway, congratulations to Shar on his first place in W Prime 32 million with the QX 9650. And next we have Wittix. He's just like I believe he recently noticed that like P45 chipset UD3 gigabyte motherboards are like really good at FSB overclocking, and since then he's been posting like massive LGA 775 scores very regularly, beating some very old records. And so this time he took the record for the E8600 just core like validation frequency. So yeah, he got the chip to 6,928 megahertz, beating the old record of 6,820 megahertz from 2009. Right, so this is a really old record that Wittix has managed to beat, and he didn't beat it by a little bit. Like that's 100 more megahertz. That's more than 100 more megahertz compared to the old top score. Oh, and this was of course done on a Rampage Extreme, and then like the next several scores are all done on Rampage Extremes. But anyway, also this is just a crazy competitive LN2 category. There are so many LN2 submissions for this CPU. Let me just show you. So we're going to look at 50 scores a page. So this is 50 LN2 submissions, and a lot of the people who have, you know, LN2 scores for this CPU probably tested multiple chips. So this is a very competitive category, and so it's like it's surprising that record held, like the old record from 2009 held for so long, and also just that much more impressive that Wittix has managed to beat it after all this time, because there's been a lot of people who have probably tried and not managed it in the past. Just looking at how many, you know, submissions there are on liquid nitrogen for this CPU. Yeah, we're at 200, like, you know, 200 to 250, and we're still seeing LN2 submissions. And there's still LN2 submissions. And some of these are like really low frequency. I wonder if that's just like the silicon quality is all over the place, or if these CPUs are just really fiddly to run properly. I don't know anything about LGA 775, but on HWbot, that is a very popular just platform to bench LGA 775. And yeah, so there's a lot of these old CPUs where you just have massive amounts of LN2 submissions. And yeah, congratulations on Wittix on like absolute like smashing the frequency record for the E8600. That's like it's been like that record's been standing for like 12 years now, and it's just like, well, somebody apparently he figured out how to get past it, and also there's got to be some amount of binning to getting an E8600 that can clock this high as well. So yeah, very very impressive score, and that's why it gets into the roundup. And now we have AKM's 3D Marco 3 GeForce GTX 770 first place score. So this is just a 11900K, you know, doing 6.8 gigahertz as you do, but also 1476 on the GTX 770's core, which is kind of high for like a GTX 770. Actually, it's not even kind of high, it is very high, considering he's apparently still on air cooling. I really wish we had a system picture for this setup here. Well, I'm not sure. That's still pretty high. Like, 770s are probably good. Yeah, most of, well, you have an LN2 card, air-cooled card, water-cooled card. The thing, like, Kepler scales with voltage, so if you have enough cooling, you can really push these cards even, like, as long as they're not overheating, you can really push them a lot. But anyway, so 3D Marco 3, like 3D Marco 3 is interesting in that this is a very old benchmark, right? It's from 2003, if I'm not mistaken. And it still cares about GPU performance. Not as much as, you know, like your Firestrike or your not as much as, you know, like Superposition or Port Royal or some of the modern benchmarks, but it still cares. Right, like you can see that from the fact that like everybody at the top of the ranking is like these are high clocks for GTX 770s. Now, AKM is really benefiting from having a 6.8 gigahertz 11900K for this. But yeah, this is a very interesting sort of old GPU benchmark where it's like, yeah, it's you run your CPU with only 4 cores and 4 threads, so you can run really high clocks, but it cares about CPU performance, memory performance, which memory performance is just a function of what's the memory there for? It's to provide data to the CPU. So we're really just talking about CPU performance again. But yeah, so it cares a lot about like CPU performance, but also GPU performance. And you can also really see that if you look at the actual world record for 3D Marco 3. Actually, I think if I just do this, yeah, so 3D Marco 3 world record right now is a 3090 at 2.8 gigahertz, right? So it's a very, very odd benchmark by like old benchmark standards where it like really does, like it still really cares a lot about your GPU frequency. Even though it's also like very much CPU bottlenecked. So for a lot of the tests. So yeah, cool score. Wish we could have a setup pick, but yeah, I just think this is like I just wanted to highlight this as a sort of like interesting old benchmark. I believe we've had 3D Marco 3 scores in past roundups, maybe. I'm not sure right now, but yeah, I stumbled across this and it's like, well, that GTX 770 is going pretty quick. And then, of course, that 11900K is absolutely flying at 6.8 gigahertz. So, anyway, congratulations to AKM on getting the top score for the GTX 770 in 3D Marco 3. Let's move on to the next score, which is ROG Fisher's CPU frequency on a Ryzen 7 5800X. He managed to get 6.3 gigahertz on all cores. To my great surprise, right? Like that's 6.3 on all of the cores. And the cool thing about this is like the funny thing is CPU frequency on Ryzen chips isn't really like a thing that people do much because like if you're serious about CPU frequency, you're going to be doing something like you're going to do an old CPU where a ton of people have tried to get the top frequency, or you're going to do an FX CPU where, you know, the goal is to hit 8 gigahertz no matter what. So Ryzens aren't very popular for CPU frequency. CPU frequency testing, as you can see from this ranking, it's not really. Yeah, there's only been 18 people who have bothered to submit for this ranking. But the cool thing about ROG Fisher's score is that if you look at all of the Zen 5000 series CPUs, his is actually like in the top 3 for Ryzen 5000 series overall. So yeah, that 5800X is going really, really fast. The thing with CPU Z validations though is that like this isn't a benchmark. Like this is very, very light. Like doing a 6.3 gigahertz, CPU Z validation is like it's just kind of like, oh, neat. It's not actual usable performance. Because I think there's a couple benchmarks that are like similarly heavy to CPU Z validations. But yeah, this is not really like, this is not usable speed. This is like screenshot speed. A very impressive speed. And you can spend way too much time trying to get that last, 5 megahertz out of your CPU. But at the end of the day, not a usable speed. And I bring that up because it's like CPU Z validations to me seem really like sort of misunderstood in that like you're not gonna run a benchmark at 6.3, like you just won't, because it'll crash very quickly. But the neat thing about CPU-Z being so low load is that you can, like, this is one of the few places where you can, like, take a Ryzen to 1.9 volts and actually see a benefit from doing that. Also, actually, let's take a look at that validation again, because a lot of the time what you focus on is, like, minimizing the load on the CPU, and to some extent that'll be, like, he's running dual-channel memory to my great surprise, but those timings... Yeah, so that's like a JDEC bin right there on the memory timings. But yeah, like the goal is to, like, with CPU Z validations, it's just like you're probably going to be running 1 stick of RAM. This one's running 2 to like this is honestly like I'm kind of wondering, like, could you maybe go like could this chip validate to 6.4 if you disabled some of the cores? Maybe. Because again, it's like this is not a usable that's the thing to me, is just like it makes more sense to validate absolute max frequency regardless of chip configuration, because it's just like this is completely useless anyway. Like you're not going to run a benchmark on, like you can't even run a benchmark on it. Yeah, like this is an interesting sort of benchmark category, because here you can really, like, because the chip isn't doing anything, you can run way higher voltage, because in any other benchmark you have a real problem with, like, if you keep raising the voltage, and even CPU-Z runs into this eventually. It's just far later than most other benchmarks, because actually let's just take a look at, like, Char's 5600X here, right? This is a 6-core chip. He's only running 1.7 volts because he actually has to run Cinebench R20. And the thing is, if you ran 1.9 volts for Cinebench R20 on liquid nitrogen, the chip would get so hot that it would actually be less stable than it is at 1.7 volts. Whereas CPU-Z, because it's not actually really doing anything, you can get away with mashing 1.9 volts into the chip because you don't have that heat problem that you would get from actually doing anything. So yeah, that's kind of the neat thing about CPU-Z, is just like it's not like this is the least practical benchmark, like category on a hardware bot as far as I'm concerned, but it's also the category where you can really just go yeet on the voltage with the CPU, because you don't have to worry about the heat output basically at all. The chip is sitting idle doing nothing to its best of its ability. And you can just, then you just have to push the frequency and hope that, like, your OS is set up so that, like you don't want to be using an OS where, like, you have a bunch of background processes running in the background, and like any amount of load that you can take off the CPU is good with something like this. So yeah, a very weird, like, it's a weird category, but it's a category that I'm a big fan of, because it's just like, yeah, you just don't see frequencies and voltages that high in basically anything else, except maybe Super Pi 1 million. Because the Super Pi 1 million is, especially on modern CPUs, finishes so quickly that it's actually comparable to CPU-Z validations in terms of load. But yeah, so cool score from ROG Fisher here. And let's move on to the last score that made it into this roundup, and that is Negative Feedback's 3D Mark Firestrike on the R9 280 run on an R9 280, running on dry ice. And like the thing is, this score got in because this is like I love this score. This is just so great. So we have a R9 280, and he's modded the crap out of it. And also, this card is actually very interesting because this is a R9 280 Wind Force card. And what's interesting about the R9 280 Wind Force cards and also the HD 7950 Wind Force cards and I believe the 7970 Wind Force cards is that Gigabyte is using a completely different voltage controller from literally everybody else making these cards, right? So the norm for a 7950 or a 7970 or a 280 or a 280X is that it's going to have a CHL8228G voltage controller. And then there's Gigabyte, which, if I'm not mistaken, this is some weird ADP thing, which has vid pins instead of like being a fully digital voltage controller. So super strange. They're the only cards that use it, as far as I'm aware. It's also a really old controller. Like, I believe that Gigabyte was using it on like GTX 400 series cards as well. So ancient freaking weird controller. But you know, like negative feedback obviously managed to mod the snot out of it. So that, like, the funny thing about some of the old controllers is they're arguably easier to work with, depending on what exactly you're trying to do. But anyway, so lots of alt mods. You know, lots of alt mods. Apparently well, you need to do the vid mod because a lot of, like, well, it depends on the controller, but some controllers, if you try to just do a feedback pin mod, they'll just shut down because the voltage is too high, so you'll trip the over voltage protection. Apparently he had an OCP mod, but he didn't need to use it, which is probably a good thing because I've seen a suspicious number of these cards with, like, what looks like exploded VRMs on eBay. So probably a good thing he didn't have to turn off the overcurrent protection because that's how you turn the VRM into a crater. Memory VRM cap modded. I would love to see the cap mods, unless he's talking about that right there, but I'm not sure. Like, I've not actually looked at this PCB of this card in a very long time, so it's really hard to tell, but I think all his mods are on the back of it, in which case, yeah, I would have liked to see the back of the card, please. And then, you know, then we have the setup here with the dry ice. And what I really like about this setup is, like, you know, so far we've looked at a bunch of scores where, well, I guess this is probably, like, the QX 9650 and then Wittix's score here with the, like, these are affordable hardware setups. This right here isn't, right? This is an 11900K with a Maximus 13 Apex. This is a, I'm assuming, Crosshair Dark Hero. Yep, that's a Crosshair Dark Hero with a 5800X. So, you know, like, very motherboard heavy setups where you have really expensive motherboards and that kind of thing. But this right here, I mean, it is still a 5800X, and that's by no means a cheap CPU, but that's a B550 Aorus Pro. I strongly approve of that motherboard choice. So yeah, that's like the thing I also like is, like, you don't, like, yeah, you do need a strong CPU, but hey, the thing is, it's not, at least he's not running like a 5950X, because there's a lot of GPU benchmarks where if you're going for hardware points, you're probably going to run into, well, 12. 12 is like the number. Like, that guy is like the main like, 12 has so many GPU top scores. And this is actually his weak version of the system. So there's a bunch of top scores from 12 where he's running a 7980XE and, like, ancient GPUs, everything on phase change. And so basically a lot of the time when you want to do a GPU specific bench, like like an R9 280 top score or some, like, mid-range or low-end older AMD GPUs, there's a very good chance that the top score is from this guy and his CPU is faster than yours. And, well, yeah, that makes it really hard to take top scores, especially in something like Firestrike where, you know, you have the physics score, and the, like, 32,000 points in physics with a GPU that's getting 12,000 points graphics score can really boost the overall score a lot. So you end up, like, not being able to take the score even if your GPU is faster, which is just sort of a unfortunate reality of how a lot of the 3D Mark rankings work, where it's like, yeah, if somebody shows up with, like, a 16-core CPU or, yeah, like a 16-core CPU, you're going to have a really hard time unless your GPU is way faster, because you can boost the overall score with just a massive physics score. But yeah, negative feedback is not on a 5950X and manages to get the top score. But yeah, like he's still getting boosted by that 32,900 points physics. Also, his memory settings are really solid, which you'd expect. Like any good kid of B-Die should be able to do 3800, 12, 12, 12, and that's what he's doing right here. A bit of a BCLK overclock to really just max out the CPU to the best. Well, just max out the CPU. And yeah, did he mention modded memory timings? Yeah, modded memory timings, BIOS power limit maxed. I mean, we can see the liquid electrical tape all over the card. Looks a hell of a lot like Plastidip. Because I'm pretty sure they're the same thing, at least if you buy the liquid electrical tape from the same company that makes Plastidip. Anyway, so yeah, actually there's one thing I wanted to check is like, wanted to check if there's a example of somebody running a really fast R9 280, but getting like completely let down by their CPU. Apparently not really. Yeah, not really. Which I'm surprised by, because these are Tahiti cards. Like, if you water cool them, they should all be going over 1300 easy. Well, okay, not easy, but a lot of them should be doing over 1300 if you water cool them. And so I'm kind of surprised that like most of these scores are in the like the 1200s. I think Tractor, I'm not sure, like depends on how old this score is. But this is new. 7960X. Yeah, see? So this is what I'm talking about. 12 and Tractor. You know, where it's like, yeah, very, very balanced GPU setups. Hey, still, congratulations to negative feedback on that really impressive R9 280 overclock. Though I do have to wonder how much core voltage he was using, because on dry ice you should be able to maybe, like, depends on the card, like if it scales. But I ran a 7950 all the way at like over 1500 core on dry ice, admittedly with like I believe 1.55 volts or something. But hey, it kept scaling, so it's like, why would you stop? Oh, also, what I forgot to mention is he has the card deframed, and you need to do this. Well, not need to, but with a lot of cards, you need to do this because on a lot of Tahiti cards, the actual die is lower than the frame around it. So if you don't take the frame off, it is physically impossible to make contact with the die. Okay. And if you apply, like, if you put a lot of thermal paste in there, it'll look like it's making contact, but it's not. Like, you need to, like, if the die is, like, you should basically, what I usually do is I'll take, like, a razor blade, and check if the die is lower, than the frame by just putting the blade up against the die, and well, either either the blade touches the die or it doesn't, because there's the frame in the way, so, yeah. Because yeah, you just want to take like a straight edge of some kind and check that the die makes contact with it. It should be pretty easy to see if the frame is too tall, but a lot of Tahiti cards will have a frame that's taller than the die. Or actually, I don't think the frame height changes. I think it's the die height that changes. Like some of them have a taller die and some don't than others. But I've not really paid that much attention to this. It's just like, yeah, I have some cards that I had to deframe, and then like my 7990s are all frame lower than the core, so yeah. And I've seen, like, I have a 280X where the core is taller. I have also had a 280X where it's lower, so it's kind of all over the place. But yeah, anyway, still a very impressive score from negative feedback, so congratulations to him on that first place 3D Mark Firestrike finish, because this is a great set. This is the kind of system I would run, except I'd be using a 5950X, especially for Firestrike. So, yeah. Anyway, congratulations to negative feedback, and that is it for this HWbot score roundup. Yeah. So thanks for watching. Like, share, subscribe, leave any comments, questions, suggestions down in the comment section below. And if you'd like to support what I do here with actually hardcore overclocking, I have a Patreon. There's a link to that down in the description below. There's also the HOC Teespring store where you can pick up shirts, stickers, posters, the usual YouTuber merch. Both the Patreon and Teespring help out immensely with running the channel, so it would be much appreciated if you would check those out. And that's it for the video. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.